and welcome back to session 2 of HTML5. In today's session, we'll be talking about HTML5 Web Workers, which is part of the performance and integration part of HTML5. So let's quickly recap what we have discussed in part 1 of HTML5. We have talked about the semantics, which provide meaningful value to your HTML page. We have talked about the new input types, and we have seen what types of validations are supported. Only a few of them that we could see in the example that we did. But again, the point is, if you are using AngularJS or some other JavaScript MVC framework, you would want to turn off the browser validations that come with HTML5. Okay, so without wasting much time, let's delve into web workers. All right, so what is a web worker? It is a spider web drawn across different worker images. My bad, that was just a joke. In all seriousness, a web worker is a JavaScript running in the background without affecting the performance of the page. Only thing is, the JavaScript that is running in the background should be independent and should be able to run on its own. That means it doesn't need to be referencing any page elements or something like that. Why exactly? We'll see in our next slides. So as we have known, as web transitions from server heavy implementations to the client side JavaScript, the challenge that has remained was JavaScript runtime. And what exactly is the problem? JavaScript runtimes supports execution only on a single thread. Yes, there is XML HTTP request, but again, it can only load resources from remote servers and get the appropriate data using an asynchronous call. But again, for those asynchronous events to be executed, they can only be executed after the current UI thread is freed. Okay, so that is a very important aspect, not to confuse between XML HTTP request and web workers. Okay, let's move on. So let's see the communication between web worker and the main UI thread. So in this case, your main UI thread starts executing, and as required, it will instantiate a web worker JavaScript file. And then after a certain point, if you are looking at the left hand side of it, we'll talk about the two-way communication. There is two-way communication and there is one-way communication. So what is two-way communication? So whenever the web page wants to talk to its worker and the worker also wants to talk to its web page, then that's a two-way communication. So all communications to and from the worker thread is managed through something called messages. Okay, so in this case, on the left hand side, focus on the left hand side. Let me get a pointer real quick. Focus on the left hand side. So we instantiate a web worker, which we named as web worker 1, and it loads a JavaScript file, like I said, which should be independent. And in the second part of it, the main page code calls something called calls post message, which is a JavaScript function to send a message to the worker. So messages is what gets transported, and how that message is posted is done via post message, which is a JavaScript function available for HTML5. Okay, then main page code calls something called a post message method in JavaScript, which sends a message to the worker, and then the worker one listens for on message event from the page and then reads that message. Then let's talk about how a worker one wants to send back its message to the main thread. So after processing, workers can call post message with the event, just how the main page was able to call a post message. Worker also can send can also call the post message and send the appropriate data in the event.data. So event.data is a property that you would want to look for when wanting to read the data from the message. So in this case, the worker one is sending back message to the web page. In one-way communication, so you only need to worry about half of it. So where a web worker is instantiated, and once the web worker finishes its execution, it calls a post message with the data in the event.data, and the web page listens to an on message event via a listener in the web page. Okay, we'll see an example of how a two-way communication is performed, which pretty much covers one-way communication. So you need to decide, that's a design choice, right? When you want one-way communication or whether you want two-way communication. What is an appropriate scenario? Anyone who has worked with long long running JavaScript functions or a lot of UI processing in JavaScript, then they probably have seen this pages or page being unresponsive. This is a typical Chrome web page which is loading a lot of JavaScript or doing a lot of background functions, and there were some interactions on the web page which made the page unresponsive because the UI thread is busy doing some background calculations, and there were some click events on the page, or we tried to drag and drop or do something funky with the page, in which case the web page UI thread is not free. To solve the same problem, we have something called web workers. Okay, so what are some factors that we need to consider? So the code that needs to be executed will have to be in its own separate JavaScript file. Okay, the next thing is, what is the browser support? What kind of browser support do I have? Do I have Chrome? So if it's Chrome, it's 4.0, IE 10.0, Mozilla, Safari, so forth. Before using any feature of HTML5, you should always check for browser support. How do I do browser support check? If you have followed my previous example, I was using Modernizer. I'll show that example again. Even if you did not look at the first session, we'll look at that, how to use Modernizer to verify if a feature is available or not. And that's how I would check browser support. And most important thing is, always terminate your web workers after the external script you are executing is finished. So when a web worker object is created, it will continue to listen for messages. So even after the external script is finished, it's uh, it's going to still keep on listening to the events. So you should always terminate web workers and free some resources for the browser, and most importantly the computer resources. You don't want your web page using up all the threads of your client machine. So for that, you would want to ideally terminate and use it, put it to better use, unless you are trying to hack somebody's web pages or something like that. That's a completely different picture. So web workers do not have access to anything related to the view of the web page. That is very important to know. So all the window dot get element by id, document dot get element by id, any window functions or elements of the view or attributes, you don't have access to them. Okay, so it's strictly an independent block of code running that can process some calculations or do some processing on a given object and send back the processed response to the web page. Okay, so they have something called a mini DOM that helps maintain separate state, but it has nothing to do with the main DOM of the page itself. So any element that you see on the web page, you don't have access to it. So if you're using a jQuery or something, then you'd probably not want to use element dot or whatever that is. Okay, so make sure you don't use anything in the web page. So another important aspect that I would recommend, there is, whenever we are talking about multiple threads being used, then in those scenarios you would ideally want to have those initial, there'll always be an overhead in creating and spawning a spawning a web worker and getting the process results from it, and there is this time that is required for communication. So those are the factors that you need to consider. So if the processing power that you're gaining out of using web worker is less than the initialization time and the communication time itself, then web worker is probably not a good candidate to use. With all the theory out of the way, Let's take a look at a live example of how to use web workers in the code. Exciting? All right, let's get started. Okay, in today's example, we will look at how to do the genotype evaluation. Uh, okay, maybe too boring. So let's look at another simple example. Sorry, I've been playing too many pranks in this session. I'll try to, I promise that was the last prank that I had. So you remember in the first session, we built this page using HTML semantics, HTML5 semantics. And so let's say this is what we want to build. We had a quiz and we want to add a timer. And this timer could be something very complicated that we want to calculate and send it back. So if you see this, then it's changing seconds. So we want to simulate this scenario using web workers. Okay. So let's take the look at the code, and it's pretty simple. I'll show you how easy it is to implement web workers. As I said, there is the start worker and stop worker. So whenever you're done with a worker, then ideally you would have to close it out by calling a terminate method. So this is the same code. So all I did was, in this first section where the quiz was, or the second section where the quiz was, I just added a timer and set out an output element that shows how much time do I have that is remaining. Okay. So let's take a look. I create a start worker, and all I did was I downloaded the modernizer JavaScript file and placed it in my project. So if you want to look at my files, it's pretty simple. If you don't have Visual Studio, nothing to panic. Even a notepad would just be fine. So I just want you all to focus on the content itself. So let me show you the files real quick. So all I did was download this modernizer from Google. Just say search for modernizer and it'll point to your website, and just download the modernizer, whatever latest version that is. Just download it, paste it in your folder. Okay. So here is my HTML page. Here is my bootstrap theme that I picked from the HTML5 part 1 session. Even if you don't have it, nothing to worry. Just keep your focus on how to wrap up this web workers part of it. Okay. I declared a variable called timer web worker, and as you can see, there is this modernizer object that we have access.